how are we going to stop the bleeding of the progressive drift?
Protect the
that was on their
fundamentals.
minds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The long-term impact that I stand in the shadow of it is that because Christians left those institutions by and large, they have continued to degenerate. And we left the cultural conversation and we established a parallel culture.
It lost its kind of sense of missionary, public-facing kind of, we need to be salt and light in the public sphere. It kind of let that go, and it was much more about personal salvation, personal spiritual growth, in church planting, in evangelism for sure. All of these things are so essential, but it lost that kind of sense that we are here to be redeeming the culture.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Ideas Have Consequences. This is the podcast of the Disciple Nations Alliance. Before I read the intro to this podcast, it is just such a fitting intro for today's episode. Today's episode, we really dove into the history of the ideas behind the moment that the church is in today in nations around the world. So I just want to prep you with that because today's episode, again, really dives into the history of the intro to this show in such a cool way. As Christians, we all know that our mission is to spread the gospel around the world to all the nations. However, our mission, the Great Commission, also involves working to transform our cultures so that they increasingly reflect the truth, the goodness, and the beauty of God's kingdom. Tragically, the church has largely neglected this second part of her mission, and today, most Christians have little influence on their surrounding cultures. Join us on this podcast as we rediscover what it means for each of us to disciple the nations and to create Christ-honoring cultures that reflect the character of the living God. Hi guys, my name is Luke Allen, and I am joined today by mi padre, my dad, who my kids have affectionately named Bop for their grandpa name for
I'm so
for you.
happy to be Bop. It's so good. Yeah.
It's a great grandpa name. Just as I was reading the introduction to this podcast, as we do at the beginning of every episode, today's episode runs through pretty much exactly that intro, but the history of it. How Christians all know that our mission is to spread the gospel around the world. However, the Great Commission also involves transforming our cultures, but the church has neglected that role, and most Christians today are having little influence of surrounding cultures. That's really what we dove into today, but actually the history of that going back the last 150, well, actually a lot longer than that, years, and just leading up to this point today where many Christians are having little influence on their surrounding cultures. Dad, just to give people a little bit more of an idea of our discussion today, which we just finished and we're about to hop into with you guys, what do we talk about today? What can people expect?
Well, we had our guest was Krista Bontrager with the Center for Biblical Unity, the Theology Mom podcast, and she's been fighting a battle to preserve the distinctly biblical roots at Biola University, and I'm so grateful that she has. She had a really terrific podcast a little while ago. Biola's founders fought modernism. Will Biola fight again? And so we picked up that podcast by looking at the history about the rise of modernism, kind of how the church responded by retreating from culture, holding on to the fundamentals of the faith, but retreating from culture. And then the downside of that was that the church became shaped by the culture, as Darrow often says, over the years. And so we look at all of that history that got us to the present moment that we're in. And I thought really the highlight for me today, Luke, was what do we do about it now? And just how can we chart a new course? But you can't go back and chart a new course without going back and understanding how you got there in the first place. Mm-hmm. So it's really an important podcast in that respect.
Yeah, exactly. I found it to be fascinating. We've talked about it a bit on this podcast, but today was the most in-depth kind of historical lesson. And I know a lot of people don't like history as much as us, so I hope you guys will stick in for this one. It's fascinating, and I think once you understand this, it really, like you said, Dad, can contextualize our place as Christians in the world today, and we can understand where we're coming from and where we're heading, what to get away from, what to get to, push towards, what to keep and what to let go of. All those things are really important as we're looking towards, as we talked about on the podcast, an extremely important, fascinating, exciting, and also scary time for Christians in the world today, where we have a real opportunity on the heels of postmodernism to possibly chart a new future. What's after postmodernism is the question for the church. There's something coming up, and it's an exciting time for us to be here, to be active as Christians. So anyways, without further ado, let's hop into this fascinating discussion with Krista Bontrager.
Well, it's great to be back again on another episode of Ideas Have Consequences, and excited to be here together with Luke, and also with someone new to the podcast and new to the team, who's actually not new to the team, Nelson Monteiro. Nelson, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Scott. Not my first podcast here, but now as a host.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right. Nelson joined the team. He's our new vice president of operations, and Nelson's been the person for the DNA over the last several years who's headed up all of our training and teaching in the Portuguese-speaking world. Has done such a fabulous job with that that we approached him about joining the team as the VP of operations, and he agreed after a lot of prayer. And so we're excited to have Nelson in the office and now on the podcast. He brings just a wealth of experience. He's based up in Victoria, British Columbia, so with his wife, Lisa. So great to have you, Nelson, joining us today. And while it sounds like Nelson's going to be our guest, that is not the case. We are thrilled to have with us today Krista Bontrager, otherwise known as a.k.a. Theology Mom. Krista, I am so excited that you're here with us today.
I'm super glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. We are such huge fans of Krista, Monique, and the Center for Biblical Unity. Just the really, really vital work that they're doing. I remember, I always think back to the dark days of 2020, you know, and when the woke revolution was at full swing, and Why Social Justice is Not Biblical Justice had just come out, and these fine people reached out and said, or I reached them, I'm not sure how we connected, but we connected and realized that we were like-minded, and we needed to stand together, and they've been just such close friends and allies ever since, and it's just meant the world to me, honestly. So can't recommend the ministry enough. Go to Center for Biblical Unity. You need to learn from them. And then, Krista, of course, you're not only are you are you the vice president, the president?
Yeah, I'm the vice
co-executive
president.
director? I don't know what your title is there. What is it?
Yeah, vice president and co-founder with my ministry partner, Monique Duson. She's the president.
Yep.
And we've been walking in this journey for the Center for Biblical Unity since February 2020.
Absolutely. But you also are, on your own, a popular teacher, Bible teacher. You're a fourth-generation Bible teacher and the host of the popular Theology Mom podcast. So you have your own teaching ministry for sure. Just a little bit about Krista. She's got her bachelor's in communications from Biola University, which, as you know, is near and dear to my heart because my daughter Kayla attended Biola. And she has her master's in theology and Bible exposition from Talbot School of Theology right there on the campus at Biola in Southern California. Krista's worked for 3 decades in various capacities in theology, apologetics, and as we mentioned earlier, she's the vice president of educational programs at the Center for Biblical Unity. So, Krista, again, thanks for joining us today. And we invited you on because we tuned into one of your podcasts here recently. The title was "Biola's Founders Fought Modernism. Will Biola Fight Again?" And I told Luke right after I listened to that, I said, we've really got to have Krista on to talk about this. And what I want to talk with you about today, Krista, is I think this history that goes back to the founding of Biola University, and more broadly than Biola, the beginnings of what some call the fundamentalist movement. This is such important history. We talk about it a lot in the Disciple Nations Alliance in terms of kind of answering the question, why is the church having so little impact on shaping the broader culture today? And I think unless you understand the history that you got into in this podcast, you can't answer that question. And when I listened to you, I thought she really understands this, and I loved the way you framed it around the founding of Biola, and then brought it right up to the present as well, you know. And so we really want to get into this, understand this history, bring it right up to the present, and see what it means for us today. So again, just really excited. This is, I just think this is such important history. So first of all, Krista, if you could just kind of walk us through the controversy that was brewing in the late 1880s, all the way up until the turn of the century into the early 1900s. What was happening in the Bible-believing church, this fundamentalist, as some call it, fundamentalist modernist controversy that was going on. What was at stake? What was happening at that time? So just take us back to that, because again, this is such a pivotal time.
Yeah, it really was. And you're so right, Scott. Like, you cannot really understand even what is happening today in our very complicated relationship that we have as evangelical Christians with the broader culture if you don't go back 100 years. And I know that sounds crazy, like most of us aren't thinking about what happened 100 years ago, but there really is some important connections historically to understand. Now, in the late 19th century, so the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a rise in confrontations against the Bible. There became doubts about whether or not the Bible was the error-free Word of God when it came to things like historical claims or claims about the physical world, like some scientific claims. And so we see this particularly in the rise of evolution coming into educational spaces. Some people may have heard of the Scopes monkey trial that happens in 1925. There was just an increasing amount of pressure socially, but also from within the church to modify how Christians thought about the Bible. And this came right in...
Krista, it was such a tipping point, because I think up until that point in the West, in the United States, the Bible teachers, biblical institutions had a lot of cultural weight and authority, right? But it was after this, there was a direct kind of frontal attack on that authority. You're right, coming from secularists, Darwinists, people, kind of these critical biblical theorists. And through a number of events, they really did kind of undermine that authority and establish themselves at kind of the center of cultural authority. And it hasn't really changed since then. So I'm sorry to cut you off, but that was kind of the pivot, wasn't it, there?
Oh, it really was. I think your phrase tipping point is right on the money, because what happened is that these ideas of undermining the authority of Scripture, undermining the supernatural nature of Christianity, things like miracles or the virgin birth, and the rise also of what was called the social gospel. Yes. All of these ideas were ways of kind of reframing the traditional historic Christian faith to accommodate the modern sensibility.
Yeah, this
and
modern
knowledge.
Era. Right, exactly.
Yeah, and so these ideas were not just cultural ideas. They came right into the seminaries and would trickle down into the pews, because as pastors went off to seminary to get educated, they would bring that education back to them, and it would come down to the regular people in the pews through the sermons. And as these ideas penetrated into the regular people, in particular, it became a divide of what we call the fundamentalists versus the modernists. And the modernists were Christians who wanted to have a more accommodating view of the faith. They wanted to accommodate things like the belief in the rise of anti-supernaturalism. And so maybe we need to reinterpret some of these miracles. Maybe this is a little allegorical. Maybe this is a little bit more poetic and not historical. Okay, so these were the modernists.
And
now,
if
the
I could add just
fundamentalists...
one thing, I'm sorry to just cut you off again there, but when I think of the modernists and the social gospel, I mean, this was the progressive era in the United States and in Europe. There was a lot of optimism. This is before World War I. We can kind of make the world this perfect place. And so you had a lot of Christians kind of they had this kind of utopian idea that we can really perfect things. but they abandoned kind of this biblical approach, biblical theory of change, if you will, and they said, like, for example, one of the key doctrines that they immediately kind of let go of was the doctrine of human, the depravity of man, and with that, this human sinfulness idea, and with that, they said, hey, no, it's no longer the gospel, the need, the regeneration that comes through faith in Jesus Christ that's at the railhead of social transformation. They said things like, we can bring the kingdom of God. We can bring the kingdom of God through enlightened human reason, science, and government programs, things like that, right? And so they stopped preaching the gospel, essentially, and they started kind of focusing attention on government, politics. And part of the reason is that people today, I think, have this allergy to politics is a right reaction to that, right? That was, this is 100 years ago, where they said, we don't need the gospel. We don't, we can bring the kingdom of God through enlightened human reason and social programs, things like that. Is that fair, Krista, from your read?
Yeah, I think that somebody like Walter Rauschenbusch's book on the social gospel is a very helpful 1-volume book if people want to get a snapshot of how the social gospel came into the church and how it was kind of, the gospel became reimagined according to this new progressive system of ethics and understanding the Bible. And the modernists were really kind of the first progressive Christians. And some of what we're dealing with today in progressive Christianity, in my humble opinion, is just the same thing the church was wrestling with 100 years ago.
Absolutely.
It's just doing it within a postmodern context rather than within a modernist context, but it's very similar issues. On the other side of the street, though, were the fundamentalists, and the fundamentalists were those Christians who wanted to hold on to a traditional understanding of the Bible, and they wanted to affirm that. So now there began to be major splits within big denominations. So no longer was the dividing line between Methodists and Presbyterians or Baptists and Pentecostals. Now the dividing line became between modernists and fundamentalists.
Right.
And so there were modernist Methodists and modernist Presbyterians and modernist Baptists. And there were fundamentalist Baptists, fundamentalist Presbyterians, and fundamentalist Methodists. So as these dividing lines shifted, the Presbyterians who were fundamentalists suddenly saw, I actually have more in common with the fundamentalist Methodist and Baptist than I do with the progressive or the modernist in my own denomination. And so that fault line shifted, and this is where we get an explosion of new denominations. So rather than the Presbyterian Church USA, now we have the Orthodox Presbyterian Church coming out of that as a fundamentalist kind of movement or splinter group off of that. And that happened down the line in many denominations. And the dividing line was over, I think if you boil it all down, is over the authority of Scripture, whether or not the Bible is the inerrant word of God, but then other things followed from that. And this is still impacting us today. We have outsourced, we have exported these ideas to the third world because we brought the social gospel into South America, and it became, liberation theology. It became Gustavo Gutierrez. We exported modernism into Africa. And so we have participated as American Protestants into exporting, I think, some very bad ideas into other countries, into the global South. And so these things are still impacting us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about the reaction of the fundamentalists a little bit, and that gets us to the founding of Biola and really some of the most elite kind of Christian evangelical universities today. They were founded by the fundamentalists who were really reacting against the social gospel and this rise of progressive Christianity that really was an abandonment of the inerrancy of Scripture and the need for the gospel at the railhead of social change. They said we've got to hold on to these, the fundamentals of the faith, and there's a place to criticize those folks, and we'll talk about that. But boy, they really deserve a lot of credit for standing strong for the Scriptures at a time when it was really under attack and could be lost. And I think if you look at a country like France, you can see how that, in many ways it was lost, largely lost. I know there's a lot more history in places like France or Germany and things like that, but there was this group in the United States, including the founders of Biola University, said we are not going, kind of over our dead bodies. We're going to fight for this. So talk a little bit about that, those folks and the founding of Biola, because Biola is just a representative of this larger movement here.
Yeah, I think Biola is a good test case to understand the dynamics of the modernist fundamentalist controversy from a historic point of view, and how it's still playing out today, which hopefully we'll get to toward the end of this conversation. But Biola University originally started as the Bible Institute of Los Angeles. Biola is an acronym. Mm-hmm. And it was part of the movement from about the 1880s through the 1920s called the Bible College movement, which was an extension of the fundamentalists. And they, during this time, what happened was there was a fleeing out of historic institutions like Yale and Princeton and Harvard, where the modernism and its ideas were taking over these historically Christian institutions. Right. And Christians were fleeing them, but they wanted to found new institutions. Where will we send our young pastors to get educated, our missionaries to get educated? We can't trust these former institutions anymore. So they set up Bible colleges. And during this time, I think like over 100 Bible colleges were founded in this very short window of time where they wanted to provide a kind of a different environment for young pastors and missionaries to learn. So Moody Bible College was one of the first, established in the 1880s in Chicago, and it is still an important institution within evangelicalism. Biola was established in the early 1900s by an oil magnate named Lyman Stewart. And he used his money from the Union Oil Company to found Biola and also to publish a series of books called The Fundamentals. And this was a series of 90 essays by scholars all over the world to try to summarize the key beliefs of the historic Christian faith. What were the fundamentals that we ought to be standing for?
Yeah, that we have to protect against this threat. Right.
Stewart played this pivotal role of doing two very important things, of founding Biola and funding these essays called The Fundamentals. And these established the core doctrines like biblical inerrancy, authority, the role of the supernatural in Christianity. And often it was tied to, the fundamentalist movement was tied to, in particular, premillennial eschatology, which was a view of the end times that before Jesus would come back, there would be 7 years of a tribulation, the rise of the Antichrist, and then the return of Jesus, and then go into a 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth. And not all fundamentalists held to premillennialism, but the vast majority of them did. And these were some of the key features of these fundamentalist training centers like Biola that sprung up during this period of time. But now there was some alternatives for pastors to go to and being equipped. And I think it was important too, because no longer, there was a sense in which the fundamentalist movement was more about the everyday man, the everyday Christian. It was no longer going to seminary, was just kind of this thing for the elites. It became more accessible for the everyday man who had a vision to become a missionary or to become a pastor. They could be equipped and trained in these Bible colleges.
Talk about, we talked about how brave, courageous, and we owe a debt of gratitude, frankly, to people like Lyman Stewart and others who said, listen, we will lose these fundamentals of our faith to this corrosive ideology of modernism, Darwinism, secularism that's coming in. We'll lose them if we don't fight for them. And so thank God. I just say thank God that they did, that they stood and they fought hard. But I think in hindsight now, we can look back and we can say they made some errors as well that created the conditions, I think ironically, for the church, like for what's happening at Biola today. And I'd like to kind of frame this, Krista, and have you respond to it. You just mentioned the formation of Bible colleges, and that's one example of what I mean by the way they maybe overreacted or overresponded, because the earlier generations of Christians set up universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton. These were universities, and there was a sense that all of these areas of knowledge were under God and His authority and needed to be understood, and we need to have people study all of this broad range of subjects, not just the Bible, but all of these subjects from the vantage point of the Bible, and they need to be in positions of leadership in our society to help shape a culture. The fundamentalists began to say, these schools, these Harvard, Yales, and Princetons have become secular. They're sending people in to shape the culture. We just need to it was almost a retreat in my view, like we need to retreat into just the Bible and into Bible colleges, and we'll just focus on the Bible and not so much on the culture, because the culture's become secular, hostile to Christianity. Is that that's? I know that I'm talking in a general way, Krista, but is that a fair assessment of some of the maybe the pitfalls that the fundamentalists fell into a little bit?
Yeah, and I say that with a heavy heart and an acknowledgement that my own grandparents heard the gospel for the first time through the Biola Hour radio program back in the 1930s during the Depression. Although they had grown up as cultural Christians in the Dutch Christian Reformed Church, they felt like they had never really heard the gospel until they heard Louis T. Talbot preaching it on the Biola Hour. So for me personally, my own grandparents were the product of the Bible college movement. My grandfather then went to a small Bible college here in Los Angeles, not Biola, but a different one, got some education and went on to become a church planter, planted 8 churches in California. Most of them are still going. And so my family is directly in line with the fundamentalist movement and has been impacted by it. Yeah. I am a Biola grad. My husband's a Biola grad. My husband's parents went to Biola. Our oldest daughter went to Biola. So we are a 3-generation Biola family. We are in the tradition of fundamentalism. But it's also good to be sober-minded about the long-term impacts that strategy, the fruit of that, and what it brought forward. And because Christians left the institutions like Harvard and Princeton and Yale because they felt like they had become too polluted by modernist ideas.
Secular.
They made a strategic decision to form an alternative or a parallel culture. And what ended up happening was by withdrawing, and I don't think they looked down the road and saw like, oh, this is going to be the long-term impact of this decision. They were just trying to pragmatically think, how are we going to train our young pastors and our future missionaries? how are we going to stop the bleeding of the progressive drift?
Yeah, protect the
that was on their
fundamentals.
minds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The long-term impact that I stand in, in the shadow of it 70 to 100 years later, if I go back to my college days, is that because Christians left those institutions by and large, they have continued to degenerate, and there was no or very little salt and light, if you will, left in those institutions to help redeem them. Now, are there exceptions? Certainly. We see those exceptions. Books like, Finding God at Harvard, help to highlight that. But I'm speaking in generalities. The long-term impact of that is that evangelicals
the Harvard
left.
we see today, right? Yeah.
Yeah. We left the cultural conversation and we established a parallel culture.
Yes.
And so if you think about like the Supreme Court, for example, to my knowledge, there are no evangelical Protestants on the Supreme Court.
That's right. There are. And not just the Supreme Court, but just about any area of kind of institutional leadership in the society, whether it's in media or, education, justice, very few are evangelicals because of the retreat that you're speaking of, right?
Yeah. And I think think about even in conservative radio. The bigger personalities are either Roman Catholics or Jewish people. Now, there are a few exceptions. Somebody like Hugh Hewitt, for example, is an evangelical, but there's not a lot. We kind of left, and we established our own publishing companies, our own institutions as alternatives, our own magazines. We established a whole Christian subculture. Yes. As evangelicals. Now,
and if I could too, I think it went even beyond that. The faith became very personal, which it is.
Yes.
But it became almost private. Like it was like it lost its kind of sense of missionary, public facing kind of. We need to be salt and light in the public sphere. It kind of let that go, and it was much more about personal salvation, personal spiritual growth, and church planting, and evangelism for sure. All of these things are so essential, but it lost that kind of sense that we are here to be redeeming the culture, to be salt and light, and yeah.
And it also became...
the irony of this too is that this sets the stage for what's happening at Biola right now, because when you retreat in that way, you're still we as Christians still live in this culture. We become shaped by it, right? If we and today that culture is largely postmodern, right? We're facing new threats, and so you see this postmodernism because we're being shaped by it, coming into places like, this is the irony, like Biola of all places, which is what you've been writing about so much here and teaching about.
Yeah, I think that evangelicals, another consequence of leaving the academic world and the academic institutions, is that we adopted a very anti-intellectual posture. And by changing the faith from being personal to private, which those words can sound kind of similar, but they actually are very different. The Christian faith is very personal in the sense that each and every one of us must put our faith, hope, and confidence in Jesus as the Messiah.
Yes.
That is, I'm not saved on my grandparents' faith. I will have to stand before the great white throne based on my own position and posture and belief in Jesus. But what we did as fundamentalists and even as evangelicals is we changed it from being personal to being private, and having a private faith. I don't bring it in the public square. I don't bring it into my politics. I don't bring it into public discussions on the radio or in the courtroom. This is something private. I'm free to worship however I want, and I'm free to believe in whatever I want. But those things have no connection to the public realm. And decades of that have now dumped us off the cliff. And now we're in postmodernism, which is taking us kind of, and some people will debate this, like, what is postmodernism exactly? Is it just taking modernism to its logical conclusion, or is it something else? I won't debate that here. But the idea that we are now in a world where there is no fixed meaning, there is no transcendent truth, there is no thing that is truly true for all of us in all times, all places, and all cultures. It is, postmodernism is the world of my personal truth.
That's right.
And everything has become totally privatized. But then also our job now in the postmodern world is to deconstruct, to take down ideas, frameworks, and even institutions that were built on this idea that there is objective truth. That is something to be attacked and to be overturned by the postmodernists. And we see this play out in literature and art and education and the social sciences and politics, is where we're reframing everything as power plays and personal truth. And we're going to deconstruct every institution, every idea, every framework that basically came before the 1960s. And so we have truly fallen into a pretty precarious situation.
Yeah. My brain is spinning right now. This is fascinating. Tell me if this is correct. I want to kind of run some thoughts by you, Krista, and I want to hear your response. So, postmodernism, like you were saying, it's hard to understand. I think it's a lot easier to understand when you understand modernism, like we've been talking about, and pre-modernism. So to sum up the last 2,000 years since Jesus, there's been these three big eras, right? Pre-modernism, a time in which the Christian church was growing, and there was a lot of respect for the church, kind of the age of Christendom.
The Bible had authority. Yeah.
Yeah. The pre-modern era, and then we came to the modern era. Why did the pre-modern era end? I would say pride of man, through the Renaissance, and then kind of the early Enlightenment thinkers, think Kant, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We came to this point where we're like, we can figure it all out on our own. We don't need God anymore, So we chucked God to the side and we said we can figure it out on our own. So this was this really optimistic era of the Enlightenment, the modern era. And then that came completely crashing down when the earliest 20th century, the World War I, World War II, and we pretty quickly figured out that modernism does not work. And Nietzsche was right when he says you kill God, you kind of ruin yourself as well. He saw where it was heading, and it headed there. And then we came to this postmodern era. Now, one thing I hadn't thought about until today is how quickly these movements of history sunk into the church, because usually the church is kind of late when it comes to cultural discussions. And when we were talking at the beginning of this discussion, for some reason, I had never made the connection between the modernist fundamentalist controversy, talking about the modernism of the Enlightenment modernism, same thing. But the discussion in the church was happening in the late 1800s, when that discussion in the broader society started in the early 1700s with, again, Kant and Rousseau. So it took a long time to sink into churches, and I think it took so long because churches were really pushing back to it. They had that forward-facing look towards culture, and they were pushing culture back because they understood, we say it all the time on this podcast, someone or some set of ideas is always actively influencing culture. And if it's not Christians, then it's going to be someone else. Culture is a tug-of-war battle, always. And the Christians coming out of the pre-modern era understood that, and they were pushing back against cultural mores and cultural lies and whatever it was. And for that reason, it took a long time for modernism to seep into the church, and then the fundamentalists, in a way, stopped it. But then the fundamentalists didn't have that offensive look towards culture. They played kind of like this defense kind of, retreat mentality, which paved the way immediately for postmodernism to just run straight through culture. There was hardly any opposition from the church, which is why we had this, the modernist fundamentalist controversy, late 1800s, early 1900s. Postmodernism starts in the 1950s, and it just comes straight into churches. There's like zero pushback in a way to a lot of churches. We see it now. We're starting to talk about it. I think people are really starting to talk about postmodernism in like the 2020s because we're seeing it actually played out in very dangerous ways in our culture.
Deconstructing our faith or this or that, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I'm looking at kind of it through this offensive defensive lens, and I don't know, it just made sense for the first time. Like when the church isn't pushing back against culture, we're just going to get run straight over. And the more we retreat, the more culture runs away from Christ, essentially, and God's ideas. So that's not really a question as much as just a reflection, and I find it interesting to put it in that light.
Yeah, I have a question, actually. At first, actually, I took a couple of notes about some of the things you said, Krista, and you talk about the global south, and that interests me because I come from Brazil. I come from Latin America. And the interesting that is talked about the rise of evangelicals preserving orthodoxy and experiencing growth in the global south, not only in Latin America, right? And I was thinking, interesting that the whole fundamentalist movement, and I come from, my origins are Pentecostals. I mean, you go to 1906, right? 1906, Azusa
right
Street,
exactly.
on this side of the U.S. And then those are the missionaries who went to Brazil and generate the whole beginning of the Pentecostal movement in Brazil, and the idea of the growth there. And I was wondering here, actually, I wonder if it's part of it was because modernism had not yet hit us with the force that it had hit Europe and North America, and that was kind of one element maybe that promoted that growth, because we're still a little bit behind in terms of the things that were happening in the West, as we're talking here, right? That gave that freedom and more space for the growth of evangelicals in not only Latin America, but the global South. So that was an interesting thought. But the other thing is, much of what we have discussed so far, what you have said, and that still has an impact on us in our society. So it goes back to modernism. But then at some point we just started to talk about postmodernism, right? And this whole force. So could you give us a summary, a brief intellectual history of how postmodernism developed?
Yeah, probably not very much. Probably not as much as Scott could do.
Well, I don't think so. No, no.
These ideas do take some time to trickle down to the regular person from academia to get them to the masses. And usually that process takes about 100 years or so of kind of cooking, if you will. But the big picture of postmodernism is to understand it as it's seen as a failure of the Enlightenment. That's kind of the big picture. And the big project is to overturn the Enlightenment ideas of objective knowledge or objective truth, this idea that of science being objective, that there is objective knowledge. These are projects that the postmodern context says, no, there is no objective truth. One of the things I did in my doctoral dissertation, I wrote on feminist standpoint theory and its impact in the church, is that I especially had a focus on the impact of standpoint theory onto the sciences. And you would think the sciences would be pretty immune from this idea of my truth. Like, we're just going to look at a beaker of chemicals. Like, how in the world does my truth change that? But the idea that even women perceive reality different than men, and or you as a Latin American, Brazilian, would see the world differently than Scott, Luke, and I, and that there's different perspectives, but these perspectives are more than just like, oh, I have some different experiences to share. It's more deeply rooted than that it even impacts how I interpret objective reality, because there is no objective reality. There's no meaning in texts anymore. The text becomes simply my own perception or experience of the text. I am not trying to find the author's meaning of the text. And so these are some of the things of what I'm talking about when I talk about deconstruction. The deconstruction project is to overturn the ideas of the Enlightenment.
I think you see this so clearly right now in the present in the whole transgender movement. I think it's just such a perfect window into this history. Because if you go back to the kind of, as you were saying, Luke, the pre-modern era where the Bible was believed, God was believed, the Bible had authority. When you get to issues like sex, male and female, we believe that because that's what the Bible teaches, right? In the beginning, God created the male and female, end of story. We all believe that as a culture, right? But then you get to modernism, and God is abandoned. The Bible, the authority of the Bible is abandoned. But as you were saying, Krista, science is not, right? So now science replaces, so to speak, the Bible and God as the source of authority. And so science tells us biologically, we can look at genes and things like this, and we can go, yep, there's male and there's female, right? That was never debated in the modern era, right? It was a scientific fact, right? Science tells us this. Now you get to postmodernism, okay? So not only is God abandoned as a source of truth in the Bible, but science itself is abandoned. Now who's the source of truth? Who's the source of authority about what's true? And I am. I'm at the center, and it's based on my feelings, what I feel strongly about. And if I'm a man biologically, but I feel like I'm a woman, then you need to affirm that because that's truth. That's, to me, just postmodernism crystallized. It's putting the person and their feelings at the center of everything. And I don't know. I've often thought that that's kind of the perfect distillation of postmodernism in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was who was it? Jean-Francois Lyotard. Wasn't that his definition of postmodernism, more or less? What was that, Krista? Yeah, I know you don't know that quote. I'm putting you on the spot.
I don't have it. You really put me on the spot here, Luke.
I know, I really am.
It
was meta-narratives and incredulity towards meta-narratives. Postmodernism's an incredulity towards meta-narratives. Question everything, which, you can't really blame the guys because their thoughts started right after World War II ended. The world's in burning, still smoldering from the war. And it's kind of that post-shock moment where it's like, what do I even believe anymore? After like any giant tragedy happens, like what's even good and bad anymore? They took that questioning, but then they ran way too far with it. And they just essentially tore down everything that had come before that point in history and said, it's all false. We got to rebuild from the ground up, essentially.
Krista, I want to take you back to Biola for a second and the podcast because this is really where this becomes relevant for the present time. And I think what you're seeing is, as Luke, you were saying earlier, postmodernism just ran kind of unopposed through the culture and even right into the church. And part of the reason that it ran right into the church, including the Bible-believing church, is because of this fundamentalist. That they sowed the seeds for it by saying, we'll just focus on the fundamentals of the faith. It was a kind of a defensive posture. And, this personal, private kind of understanding of the faith. Meanwhile, the culture has become very postmodern. And in a way, then the Christians, as Darrow Miller, often will say, if the church isn't actively discipling the nation is discipling the church. So you get this irony where, present-day Biola is being deeply influenced by postmodernism, and this is the question you raised in your podcast, is, 100 years ago, Biola saw, it was raised up to stand against this hostile kind of threat to the Bible and to the gospel that was coming in at that time. Will present-day Biola do the same? It's with this current kind of woke Marxist postmodernist threat. And what we're seeing is a kind of a mixed story on that. How do you answer your own question there, Krista? I know that you've put a lot of thought into this. The question being, will Biola fight again? Will it be true to that DNA that essentially was there at the beginning?
Yeah, and I think to provide a little bit more context to what you're getting at there, after World War II, I think that there started to be a shift in the Bible college movement toward how do we get back a sense of academic respectability. And there was the rise of another movement called the neo-evangelical movement. And this was kind of in the 50s and 60s. And it was part of Billy Graham, Carl Henry,
Yes.
and others, where they wanted to forge a path back toward re-engagement with the culture.
Right.
They wanted to find a way to hold on to orthodoxy, to hold on to those fundamentals, while also beginning to re-engage the culture. And so things like Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity.
Yeah, Food for the Hungry, the
even,
group that we were a part of for many years, started out of that same movement.
Okay.
World Vision.
Yeah, and
all of them.
Yeah, World Vision, Christianity Today, the National Association of Evangelicals.
Right.
These were all part of what was called the neo-evangelical movement of like, hey, like the whole retreat from culture thing, that might not be working out so well for us. We're about 50 years into this social experiment. How do we begin to re-engage the culture? This is also the time during which like the Jesus Revolution starts happening. And so a lot of things that they were rethinking. Biola.
When did Biola become a university? It used to be,
that's
as
what
you
I was
say,
just going to
Bible
get
College
into.
of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
But when did it become Biola University? Because this is what we're talking about now, isn't it?
Yeah. So it became a Bible college I think around the mid-1950s, but it became a university in 1983 or 84. And it was about that time where we really started seeing a lot of shifts from, first there was the migration of a lot of Bible institutes and informal training programs into formal colleges, and then into universities. How do I get accreditation? How do I hire people with PhDs and doctorates to begin to re-engage the culture and to provide, again, wanting to hold on to those fundamentals, but wanting to do it in a more academically rigorous way. And so many of these institutions went the first phase was like making them into Bible colleges and then into universities. And so like here locally, we have Azusa Pacific College, when I was growing up, is now a university. Hope International College is now Hope International University. Same with Biola. And so a certain percentage of these institutions evolved over time. But where we find ourselves now is that many of these Christian higher ed institutions have been recruiting professors who have done their doctoral programs at secular institutions in the 1990s, roughly. A lot of them in the 90s and early 2000s. Because to boost their accreditation and to boost their academic credibility, they needed to begin to hire faculty that had PhDs from secular and European institutions. And they're kind of started chasing, the former Bible colleges are now chasing the very thing that they wanted to get away from 100 years ago. But many of them are trying to do it in a way of still holding on to their statement of faith that they started out with, in Biola's case, over 100 years ago, but then hiring these faculty. And what's ended up happening for many Christian institutions, and I would say this is even also true of other Christian institutions that we have known, if they've been around for 50 to 100 years, they are struggling with these same issues of how do we stay relevant? How do we incorporate cultural re-engagement and holding on to our legacy as Christians? And what has happened in many of the Christian higher ed institutions is that there's been a drift. They've brought in professors who have been trained in the very ideas that they were trying to escape 100 years ago. And so what's happened is that there's kind of this forward-facing look to the outside world, to donors and partners and prospective parents and alumni, that, hey, we are still holding on to those fundamentals. Look, our doctoral statement hasn't changed. But internally, we have hired a bunch of people who have had their education in progressive schools and are kind of just sprinkling Jesus on top of that and bringing it into the Christian institution. And so now we are in an era of, I think, that is not dissimilar to where the fundamentalists were 100, 120 years ago, of how will we preserve our institutions, our Christian institutions. The approach that I have been taking is, for the last 5 years or so, is publicly speaking in particular about Biola, because it's the institution that's close to my heart, and it's the institution that I want to fight to save. But what I am fighting for is not burning the institution down, not leaving it, not abandoning it. I am trying to fight for renewal.
Yes.
And to do something different than what my grandparents' generation did in leaving the institutions and forming a parallel culture. I am trying to fight for, by calling on the leaders to fight for the original vision of what we were trying to do 100 years ago, which is a return or a steadfastness to those fundamentals, because those are things that are still true today. So that's going to mean that some of our institutions are going to have to part ways with people that they have hired internally who are progressive leaning or who have imbibed the postmodern ideas. And so that's kind of the model that I have been talking about. I'm just using Biola as a test case. And I do want to say, like, Biola has made tremendous changes. When I first started speaking about these things 5 years ago, they were in a pretty dark place. They had on paper orthodoxy, but behind the scenes, they had hired a significant number of progressive-leaning professors and staff who were implementing policies and curriculum based on postmodern ideas. They have turned that back in many ways.
Yes. Yeah. No, you're right to bring that up. But I want to draw a parallel to the world that I grew up in, to what you're talking about, Krista, the world of Christian relief and development, because you're right. The neo-evangelical movement is where, the fundamentalists said, hey, we've got to re-engage culture. And it gave rise to Christian relief and development. During the fundamentalist time, the heyday of that, it wasn't uncommon for evangelicals who had been very involved in ministry to the poor to kind of start slowly abandoning that, because it didn't really connect to the fundamentals. It was always seen as important, but not really important, and the scriptures like the poor will always be with you would kind of get thrown out there. And, it's kind of a futile thing to even help the poor because it's just this kind of unsolvable problem. Then the Carl Henry, the neo-evangelicals gave space to say, no, we've got to, get back into culture. Let's get back into fighting against poverty, the rise of food for the hungry and whatnot. But because they'd been out of the picture, that, for what now, 50, 100 years, the people that dominated that space, in this case, relief and development, poverty fighting, or it could be, just like you were saying, in the university setting, sociology, any of these disciplines that weren't, the fundamentals of the faith, let's say, those discussions had been carried by non-Christians, right? They were now the leaders in those fields. So when Christians got back in, here's the mistake I think they made, is they just bought into the systems that were in place, but they prayed in the morning because they were Christians, right? So we saw this in Food for the Hungry, where our approach to poverty fighting wasn't really significantly different than any secular, relief and development organization. It really wasn't, even USAID. But we were Christians, and we were motivated to help the poor out of the Bible, what the Bible taught. And we prayed, but that prayer was very private and personal. And then when we went to work, we did it according to the principles that were dominant in the field at the time. And I see a parallel to what you're talking about with the universities. So universities get back into all of these different areas of society with neo-evangelicalism, but instead of doing it in a distinctly biblical way, saying, how do we do this biblically, they just borrowed the ideas that were dominant. And you see this, like, even, for example, in the whole social justice movement, right? We'll borrow all of that, bring that right into our curriculum, our classrooms, and And what I see you guys doing, for example, at the Center for Biblical Unity is pushing back in the right way, saying, no, we need to be involved in justice, but we have to do it biblically with very biblical definitions. It's going to look very different than the kind of postmodern social justice, Marxist social justice. So you're thinking that through, you're writing the curriculum, you're doing it the right way. I just think that's I want to applaud you for that. I think that's the opportunity in front of us now going forward. Is it's not enough just to re-engage culture. We have to re-engage culture from the first principles of the Scripture and rethink all of this stuff that we kind of lost in a sense. And when we hired, the leaders, the academic leaders of economics and business and sociology or whatever it was, and we brought them into the universities, like you were saying. Any reaction or thoughts to what I'm saying, Krista, on this?
Oh, yes and amen. I mean, I think it's exactly a parallel to that. And I mean, I see this in Christian higher ed all the time. People are like, well, there was nothing distinctly Christian about my master's program in social work when I went to this big name Christian university. It was all the same ideas. We just prayed at the beginning of class.
Right.
And from my standpoint, we have to do the hard work of what is the distinctly Christian framework for helping the poor? What is that exactly?
Or for justice, as opposed to just bringing in this whole concept of social justice from neo-Marxism, right?
And we can't just say, love. We're just going to fly everything under the banner of love. We've got to do more than just this minimalistic, Jesus wants us to have love for neighbor, and then we're going to fly in every crazy socialist policy under that. No, there is a distinctly Christian way that God wants us to go about this project. What is that? And that is the question that we are asking at the Center for Biblical Unity. We are not about bringing in diversity, equity, and inclusion, sprinkling Jesus on top of it, and then sending that out into Christian higher ed. We are trying to fight for a distinctly Christian approach.
A real biblical way of understanding this. And I'm so glad. That is, to me, that's where we're at today. This is the opportunity in front of the church. You guys are paving the way. You're not just reacting against, you could just be fighting that social justice strain at Biola and trying to rip it out and saying, these chapel speakers or curriculum or professors, they all need to go. Okay, yes, you're right. But as Nancy Pearcey says, you've got to offer something better, and the better is what the Bible actually teaches about these things. But we've kind of gotten out of the habit of doing that kind of work because, again, it's we've reduced, this is, again, I think the error that the fundamentalists made. We've kind of reduced the Bible to evangelism, personal faith, etc. We just got out of the work of thinking biblically from first principles about all sorts of things. And that's what you guys are trying to do, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to say very clearly that Biola has made significant improvements in turning around, and they are a good test case for what can be done. I want to encourage everyone to listening to this podcast to fight for your favorite institution. Institutions matter.
Yes.
They are part of what provide us generational stability. And so I am not here to burn down Biola or any other institution. I think Christianity Today should be really called Progressive Christianity Today. I think it's pretty progressive. That's an opinion.
Yeah,
don't write to my good friends here at Disciple Nations if you don't like that opinion.
It's heartbreaking. Let me just be honest. It's heartbreaking because we know the history of these powerful institutions. Christianity Today has done such good work.
Yeah,
it's heartbreaking.
And I want these institutions to survive and to thrive and to turn back. And so I want to encourage everyone who's listening to this podcast today to fight for your favorite institution. If you love a particular Christian college because you came from there and you're seeing drift on social media, don't just abandon them. Start to fight back, and we all can fight different ways. I mean, if you want to craft a carefully worded letter, that's great. I did that in the beginning too. And then I escalated that a little bit more and started writing blog posts and posting on social media and making videos. Not everybody's called to that. But
I do think the tactics that you've used, the approach that you've taken with Biola specifically is a model. I want to recommend it to people that are called to do similar work regardless of the church or institution. that, may be on your heart. And I want to applaud you, Krista, because Biola is not just any institution, Christian institution. It's a leading one. Christian universities all over the country and the world look to Biola. It's worth fighting for. And I see you right on the forefront of that. And again, it's not just fighting against, these bad neo-Marxist, postmodernist ideas that have come in. It's doing the work of calling them to something better and saying the Bible offers something so much better on this question of racism and or race and unity. I mean, there's nothing like what the Bible teaches on that. It's so beautiful, powerful. So
yeah. I mean, it's an approach you don't see often at all. Is this reformation, reforming things, rebuilding things? And in a world where everyone just likes to tear everything down, just rip it apart, with no plans of the future and building their own thing, but just rip it apart, This idea of rebuilding is so beautiful to see. But I do have an eye on the time, Krista. I'm sorry we're already over time, but I just am itching to ask you this question. When I was looking at Christian schools, and you addressed this a little while back, is I wanted to go to a Christian school, but one of the drawbacks for me is there's not the intellectual rigor and prestige that comes with a degree from pretty much any Christian school in the country, which is a bummer. If you have a degree from Princeton or Harvard, everyone's like, oh, wow, Ivy League, and much better hires and all that. But this, and I don't think the Christian schools did themselves much good when they kind of had this approach towards anti-intellectualism. We were talking about that a few weeks ago on the podcast, is this kind of approach that, like, we got to stay away from the secular topics, just the Bible, which to the world says we don't take those things seriously. Therefore, probably that's how we ended up with this, persona to the world. How can Christian schools, I don't know if it's even a recover, but how can Christian schools have, build programs that are intellectually rigorous and taken seriously and can build kind of a prestigious institution? Not that matters too much, but it is very helpful for the students.
Culture, can actually have some weight in terms of shaping a culture.
And that,
right?
yeah. Mm-hmm. But it's also just, I mean, I'm looking again, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, all Christian colleges. So they figured it out. What's different with these new Christian colleges? Like, what did we get wrong?
Oh, that's a whole podcast, Luke.
Sorry.
I think that we're living in a day and age where I think that, and this is an opinion, but I think as we move forward, we're living right on the cusp right now of a revolution in artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of studies right now that are happening on the impact of that, of technology on education. There's one school of thought that thinks that schools won't even be needed anymore because we'll just give people computers and they can teach themselves everything. Mm-hmm. There's another school of thought of emerging data that technology actually hinders learning. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, this is a speculation, but I'm wondering if one of the things that could differentiate Christian institutions over the long haul is our disengagement with technology as a tool of learning in many cases. That we go back to pencil and paper, taking notes and reading physical books, because there's an emerging body of research that shows that people learn better, it registers in their brain better, it forms neural pathways that are more firm when they are engaging in these sorts of real-world tools versus just clicking on their laptop in class or using AI to generate their answers or book summaries. I think that for the long haul, Christians have a real opportunity here to return to, and some of this is already happening with the rise of classical education, of returning to the classics. But I think that I'm personally a skeptic of a lot of education technology. Now, that's not to say I'm a Luddite and I'm against computers, but I think that if we really want to help students grapple the most with the ideas, we've got to go back to paper and pencil testing. And I don't know if you're old enough to remember blue books, Luke, but we got to go back to blue books and paper books and that there's so much research that this is how the brain, God seems to have designed the brain to learn the most. And so I think that is an opportunity for Christian institutions to think about something that could differentiate them from the noise of all of the other institutions. And I think the other thing that we could offer as Christians in our higher ed, and this is something I think that Biola actually does pretty well, is having relationships with our students, that it's more than just the book learning, but that there is relational things happening and discipleship. I know for me, I was so impacted by my professors at Biola, and I think that ethos is deep into the Biola culture. And I would like, that to be true at more Christian institutions where there is that relational component and discipleship and the careful hiring of people who love students as much as they love the information.
What I hear you saying here, Krista, is it's not just the content that we need to teach differently, but it's how we need to teach. The pedagogy itself needs to be distinctly Christian and rooted in a deeply biblical understanding of what it means to be a human being, right?
I've reflected a lot on that Jesus is called the Logos of God. He's called the Word. But we are raising a generation who doesn't know how to interact with words on the page. They have AI write their book summaries for them. I'm concerned about a generation that doesn't have strong reading skills. Because if you do have strong reading skills, you can teach yourself anything. But if we don't have strong reading skills, how will we interact and engage with God's Word? And reading the AI summary is not the same. Not the same.
No. Boy, this is another podcast. Luke, sign up, Krista. We need to have another podcast on this. This is really important.
I know. But I keep saying this, in the age of AI, which we're entering, if you want to be taken seriously and you want to, exponentially, I can't even use my words. See, I use too much technology. If you want your worth in the economy to grow exponentially, two things. Be known for your integrity and your truthfulness, because in a world of AI, truth is going to become the currency that's just going to skyrocket. And then be able to critically think. And the best way to do that is paper on pen. Just think about our founding fathers. Some of the smartest people this country has ever produced usually grew up in cabins with two books, the Bible and, something by Locke probably, and brilliant men who knew multiple languages. So you can do it. You don't need technology.
And also the whole issue of discipleship, right? That's another podcast.
Yep.
Discipleship, how our institutions really discipling, how our churches, us as parents, what we understand by this. So that's a whole other issue, right?
Yeah, you're right to bring that up. I mean, really, I think the line between discipleship, Nelson, and learning, teaching, training, it blurs. It really does. So, I understood this when I was a parent with my kids. Where does education stop and discipleship start? Well, it's hard to draw that line. So.
Krista, just as we're wrapping up here, for listeners who are feeling overwhelmed by all these cultural shifts and postmodernism in itself, it's hard to even define, as we were explaining. It's just a lot. It's how do I wrap my head around all these things? It's moving so fast, not to mention all the theological debates that are constantly happening in the church that can be very overwhelming and confusing for people, especially if you're a newer believer. What are practical next steps that we can take at this moment? I love the idea of calling our institutions back to their Christian institutions, back to their foundings, back to the cornerstone, that firm cornerstone, the rock on which we stand. But what else can we do? What other takeaways can we take away from this discussion?
Yeah, I think one thing you could do that's really easy is just download our mobile app from the Center for Biblical Unity. You'll be able to get a ton of content across all our platforms, all there. It's all free, and just be proactive to learn more about the faith. And one of the things that we do at the Center for Biblical Unity is try to disciple people in these cultural issues, help them to think just in a distinctly Christian way, but also connect them with other ministries like Disciple Nations. We have a whole page on our website of other like-minded ministries that will help you learn more about the faith. So that's really my number one is be proactive, learn more about the faith. daily Bible reading. And I really want to encourage people to read through the Bible together as a family with your children. One chapter a day, out loud, discuss it together. Because in an age where the only scripture that most young people are interacting with is a few deconstructed verses that are flashed up on a screen on Sunday, it's easy to deconstruct from a faith that you never knew. And if children do not read the Bible, they don't know what they're really even walking away from. And so read through the Bible, one chapter a day, and discuss it together as a family. Total game changer. If you want to know more, there's a go on my Theology Mom channel, YouTube channel. I have a whole training about it, walk you through it. So those are my number one, and number two is be proactive and daily Bible reading with your children. Third is commit to a local church that unashamedly affirms historic Christianity. Like, not a mushy middle church, not a church like, well, yeah, it's on paper, it's on our website, but we don't really talk about it. And, we're not going to talk about politics or social issues because that's private. Like, go find the church in your community that unashamedly affirms historic Christianity and is willing to have the conversation of how does the Bible apply to the very complicated world that we live in and those social issues. Fourth, I would say build a little community of like-minded families with other children. Go camping, have pool parties, do crazy stuff to build a community with other like-minded families who want to walk in the Christian worldview and that can foster accountability.
Awesome. Great. Thanks for being with us today, Krista. It's been a great discussion, and yeah, it really is an exciting time. As many challenges as we face, I feel like there really is a time for us to turn a corner right now and do something, kind of get away from some of the mistakes that were made, going back 100 years, and try to learn from those mistakes and plow a new way forward here. So that's my hope, anyways. God bless you, Krista, and thanks for being with us again today.